Of the divine and beastly we are bound, of the flesh reaped from hollowed ground. Though the heavens may call, our nature twice mixed, the ethereal, the primal, our spirits affixed. Twilight horizons our constellated fate bore, a duality, a rending, an internal eternal war. Angels struggle and beasts travail, upon our thoughts, upon the veil. Bound are we upon mortal coil, where gods and beasts forever toil. To walk through heaven our souls afire, limited, limitless, thus do we expire. Jaegryn, a place for beasts. Jaegryn sat in the back corner of Ashim's keep, where he could lean back and use the shadows like a cowl. From there he could watch the locals. From there he was out of sight, and therefore blessedly out of mind. Thus far he'd interacted with few of the inhabitants, and for that he was thankful. The trip out here was another bust, another waste of his time. It was just another backwater hole on the edge of the imperial interior. He lifted his mug of ale, pressed the soft wood of the rim to his lips and drank. The mug lent the otherwise bland ale, which was apparently the pride and joy of the tavern, a special family secret passed down from generation to generation, a nutty flavor. Like the ale, the small town of Havensgrad was bland, unique in the same way that all backwaters were, and yet, like the nutty flavoring of the mug, he was somehow finding himself enjoying the experience. It's the small things, he told himself. Earlier that day, he had stood beneath the shadow of thick, rugged trees that stood like monuments to the ancientness of these wilds. From there, on the border between forest and town, he had searched for the one universal thing that all colonies seem to have: drop containers. Those ugly, squat, square buildings that had been given to the first wave of colonists with the intentions of doubling first as an efficient storehouse, and then later as converted houses or governmental buildings, should the local populace be so inclined. In his youth, Jaegryn had seen them in paintings, depicting the brave settlers who ventured out into the unknown reaches of the imperial frontier, their polished gray metal always shimmering in the sun, their sides tattooed with the holy symbol of the imperial goddess. They were a symbol of order juxtaposed against an otherwise chaotic universe. And for that, Jaegryn hated them. He hated them for marring the pristine wilderness around them, hated them for sticking out and being different. Jaegryn was pulled from his thoughts as the door opened. A rowdy trio entered the tavern, adding their incessant chattering to an already loud din of sound. Jaegryn watched them make their way to the bar and flop down on the wooden stools. His eyes drifted to the rest of the tavern. Swirling patterns of grain covered everything in their sacred, unknowable insignias. In a way, the tavern was a microcosm for the rest of the town. All wood, rugged, natural, enjoyable. Jaegryn leaned back, pressing his head against the wall, and closed his eyes. The noise of the people washed over him like a waterfall, threatening to drown out what little inner peace he had. The heavy thud of approaching footsteps made his eyes snap open. A deep, dissatisfied growl rumbled in his chest. The bartender, a tall, barrel-chested man with bushy eyebrows, set another mug upon the table. Jaegryn eyed it. He hadn't ordered a second round. He was only halfway into his first. "Yer Jaegryn," the man said. "You'll be needing a room for the night." Jaegryn didn't say anything, only kept his gaze fixed upon the man. The man shifted from foot to foot. He licked his lips, his hands wrestling with one another in an aggressive attempt to soothe his anxiety. "Satyr's eye," the man said, lifting his hand and jabbing a finger towards the ceiling. When Jaegryn didn't respond, the man continued. "A wicked omen comes to vex the good people of Havensgrad. Marks the end of the harvest season. Shame, as old Jasner didn't quite finish his harvest." Jaegryn tilted his head. Despite himself, he was intrigued. Why not finish? "He can't. That's the way of things. We leave it as an appeasement to the eye." Jaegryn's brow furrowed and he leaned forward, resting his arm against the table. An involuntary shiver rushed through the man. The dim light of the tavern had caught Jaegryn's eyes, causing them to shine. The first time he'd seen that particular mutation, it had startled him as well. Appeasement? Are you troubled by heathen gods? No, my Jaeger. A god butcher saw to that. Purged the lands of their rebellion quite nicely. Most of the wretched things refused to submit to her imperial majesty, but since then, the wilds have been much quieter. Jaegryn rumbled his agreement. The wilds had been unusually tame. He'd hardly run into any signs of spirits as he made his way down from the landing pad on the nearby plateau into the town proper. The wilds were lush and thriving, yet somehow they were subdued, lacking some sort of unknowable vital essence. Now he understood. The primals that had once dwelled here had either been forced into fealty or were sacrificed. What was more interesting to Jaegryn was that the ecclesiarchy sent a godslayer and not an imperial binder. Primals weren't gods per se, but they were useful in Hexatech nonetheless. He let that unanswerable question fall away as he fixed his gaze upon the man before him. Sighing, he motioned for the bartender to sit. The man took a glance around the room and then over to the bar. A young woman with unruly red hair gave him a nod when she saw him looking her way. From what Jaegryn had seen, she was the law here, the one who kept the chaos at bay. Earlier, a brawl had broken out. Jaegryn had watched curious as she walked into the midst of the two men wrestling with one another. Several quick strikes, and they were both down. The tavern owner sat, leaning heavy against the table as though he were laying down a great burden. I'm surprised no one has said anything, though. The man trailed off. Jaegryn cocked an eyebrow, tempting the man to continue the thought. The man shook his head, deciding against it. Everyone must have assumed that's why you were here. That caught Jaegryn's attention. There was only one reason why someone like him would be here. Tamping down on his anticipation, he forced himself to take another swig of ale. The bartender leaned in closer, lowering his voice. The old-timers said that the creature didn't show up until after the gods died. Some figure they were keeping it that way. Now it shows up when Satyr's eye hangs overhead, casting its malevolent gaze down upon us faithful folk. Jaegryn's heart pounded in his chest. The question rushed out of him before he even knew that he was talking. It only appears under specific astronomical conditions. Aye. The old familiar rage bubbled up within Jaegryn. He scraped his fangs together as he chewed on this new bit of information. There was a foundling here. If that were true, that meant there was a tear in the veil somewhere around here. It was probably made when the primals were slain. His jaw clenched. There was nothing worse in this universe than the disgusting things that crawled out from the foundations. Tell me more. They say that it lingers up on the edge of the forest, that it doesn't dare breach the boundary of the town. Curious, Jaegryn thought to himself, what kind of monster did that? Most he'd run into had no hesitation in entering small communities, so long as the proper conditions were at play. Has anyone seen it? Aye, my Jaeger. It's slender, as though emaciated, hunched with long, lanky arms, used to run, but it can't stand up and stare you in the eye. And the face, oh goddess, the face. It's like seeing a thin skin wrapped tightly about a canine skull. Ugh, most claim it doesn't even have a nose, only the jagged bones where one should be. Just then the door to the tavern was flung open, and a shrieking wail slipped through the noise, beating it into silent submission. All eyes turned to see a haggard woman standing there, wide-eyed and chest-heaving. He's gone! The tavern owner jumped up, hitting the table with his belly as he lifted himself from his seat. Leela, who's gone? My son! He went into the woods at dusk. Said he was looking for Asa. The tavern owner's face dropped. He turned to Jaegryn. What's happened? Her son Yavik is betrothed to Isa. The lady is one of our best hunters. She's been pushing herself the last week, hunting game to make up for the crops that went to appeasing the eye. We haven't seen her in 2 days. We need a search party, the mother screamed, searching with pleading eyes at the other members of the community. None would match her gaze. Jaegryn grabbed the mug and guzzled it down. It actually wasn't that bad now. He rose to his feet and marched over to the mother. Which way? You can't go out there alone. We need a... Which way? He said. This time it came out like a low rumble of thunder. North of town. He was headed towards the cliff face where Isa likes to set up camp. How far? I don't know. I don't go into the wilds. 5 miles, the tavern owner said. Jaegryn glanced over his shoulder and gave the man a nod. He made his way to the door. He lingered there at the boundary. The warmth of the tavern at his back battled against the cool autumn air before him. No one's ever returned from hunting the creature, the tavern owner said, calling after Jaegryn. He nodded. What he really meant was that no person had ever returned. Fortunately for them, he was no such thing. Jaegryn stalked between the massive trees, slipping in and out of the shadows that were so deep, so dark, that they seemed to swallow up what little moonlight there was. A cold wind rushed through the trees, causing their tops to scrape against the heavens above. A high-pitched hoot sent a flock of black shapes darting away from a nearby tree. Jaegryn paused, pressing himself against the rough tree bark, and breathed deep. The cocktail of the woodlands swirled within him, a mixture of the vibrant plants, the heady sweet perfume of foliage, pines, and fungal decay. It was the smell of the ancient, the primal, better than any incense, better than anything civilization could ever make. Pressing forward, he made his way deeper into the wilds. Only the soft crunching of the forest floor, a smooth, intertwining tapestry of pine needles and dried leaves accompanied him. He stopped at the edge of a clearing. There, in its center, was a black boulder. Dull streaks of minerals shimmered in the pale, sullen moonlight. This wasn't just a boulder. It was a marker, a natural throne of some primordial force that had once laid claim to these lands. Now it sat empty, the edges of the peak worn smooth by the quiet passing of time. Yet its pointed tip still remained razor-sharp, like a single bony finger thrusting imperiously towards the heavens. He hesitated at the edge of the clearing. His insides churned as he stepped back. There were things even he would not hunt. God-slayers, binders, they were madness incarnate. Monsters, he understood. They bled, they died. But gods and spirits? Madness. Instead, he chose to skirt around the clearing, paying its sacredness the respect it was due. He listened to the soft stillness that had fallen over the place. It didn't impose itself upon the world, but rather upon him. A bird squawked, the noise piercing the silence as the echo raced between the trees. His own breaths, by comparison, were swallowed up by the forest. Only the faint rustling and chirping of the birds and the orchestral song of the cicadas and frogs could speak here. Each sound was held, inspected, and judged by the silent sentinels that towered over them. This was a place for them, not for him. And yet, could there ever be a place for something like him? A longing stirred within him, a desire for these strange and alien wilds, these untamed lands that surrounded him. It was a feeling buried deep within him, a raw, uncut gem that longed to get lost within these worlds and never return. Yet this wasn't his domain. His den laid within the concrete and iron jungles of civilization, the crude constructs of those who'd clawed their way from their primal, ancestral home only to lay siege to it. Bit by bit, their war of fire and smog would be waged, all because avarice, once tasted, was found to be too fine a wine to be laid down. Their eyes and his destiny would be caught somewhere in the midst of a crusade to bring order to the rest of these wilds scattered across the galaxy. For now, he shouldered the burden and carried on. He needed to focus. He was on a hunt after all. He continued to stalk forward for some time. Eventually, he caught sight of disturbances. A broken limb at chest height, the smashed remains of moss upon a thick, wide root. He followed them for some time, losing himself in the pursuit. Then all at once he stopped. Frozen in mid-step, he placed his boot down, careful to smother any sound he would have otherwise made. He'd been stealthy, Far more stealthy than any human had a right to be, he sniffed the air. The wind shifted, bringing with it the pungent odor of sweat and fear. He huffed it out. He'd found the sun. For a long moment he remained where he was, concealed within the shadows of a tree, gazing out, searching for the telltale sign of the man he now knew was out there. At last he spotted a silhouette moving through the trees. The movement was jagged, rough, but not without a grace developed from long stretches of time out in the wilderness. Even in the low moonlight, Jaegryn could make out his features, his wild mane of hair and tattered clothes. He'd been reckless, ambling around.
Giza!
Jaegryn growled, tearing himself away from the shadows. Quiet! His demand was carried on the wind and caused the man to flinch as though he were struck. He turned to see Jaegryn and let out a shout. Jaegryn's jaw clenched. The man stumbled back. Jaegryn knew that he'd been baring his teeth. You have to act civil, he told himself. He marched forward, careful to scan his surroundings as he closed in on the man.
The Jaegryn, the man sputtered. I'd forgotten you were here. What brings you out here?
You. So this is Yavik. Jaegryn stood motionless, and then realized he was once more unnerving the young man before him. I am... You may call me Jaegryn.
I thought that was the name of your order.
We are the Shikari now. A deep line of concentration creased Yavik's forehead. His face was set with a confused look that the young man seemed comfortable wearing. From the lines upon his face, Jaegryn would bet he was no stranger to that expression. Many had the same expression when he told them what to call him. To them, names were sacred. They made up the person. To him, it was a memory of a time when he'd been happy, when he'd been naive and thought that happy endings were the only way to end a story. He'd abandoned his name the day they'd given up searching for her, left it there in the soft earth at the edge of the forest where they'd played and later met in secret. He blinked, turning away from Yavik. He gazed up into the small patch of stars that struggled to be seen through the dense canopy. Names were complicated, carrying one's history with them. Instead, he had chosen a title. It was a way of reducing himself, getting rid of all that useless nuance. It allowed him to become focused, to become something he was not. Now he wore that title as a way of concealing what he was. I need your help. Jaegryn's eyes flicked to the side where he eyed the young man. There was a deep urgency in his voice, a wavering desperation that cut to the core of Jaegryn's being. Take me to her camp. He shook his head. She's not there. Take me there. Yavik's nerves boiled over. Jaegryn could see it in the trembling of his shoulders. Yet when Jaegryn turned to face him, the anger that had welled up within him, working itself into a frenzied shout, died in his throat. Instead, he nodded his head and pointed before walking in the direction he'd indicated. The two of them forged through the thicket of trees, navigating their way to the camp. Pale, silver moonlight spilled like water down the cliff face that rose up in the distance. They stepped out from the forest and onto the hard, rocky terrain. Yavik jogged over, pointing towards a small, broken campfire. Jaegryn followed, though at his own pace, his eyes continuing to scan the edge of the tree line that surrounded them. The camp was a disaster. The fire pit was dark and empty, the atmosphere filled with the ghostly remains of the smoke and cinders that had once danced in the air. A blanket lay in tatters on the ground. A shirt had been caught by an arrogant gust of wind and was now snagged on a nearby bush. Everything pointed to a sudden escape. See, I told you! Jaegryn ignored the younger man. He circled the camp, sniffing the air, eyeing the various disturbances like a detective at a crime scene. He inhaled again, searching for another hint of where she'd gone. He knelt down and picked up one of the blankets. He held it up to his face and inhaled. He held the scent in his mouth. There was a distinct aroma of flowers with the hint of copper. He dropped the blanket, He shifted from one foot to the other, rocks crunching beneath his feet, though he was too deep in thought to notice.
She ran off to the west,
he told himself, taking a step forward and inhaling. He could smell her now, though it was faint. Fear followed her. She was running from something. He gazed down the edge of the cliff face where she'd run. He turned his back to her path and fixed his eyes upon the tree line. Marching over, he set to work inspecting the area. As he approached, a scent began to fill the air before him. He was a dozen paces away from the camp now, and with each step it became stronger and stronger, like a thick, unseen fog. "What's that smell?" Jaegryn grunted. Even the human could smell it. He sniffed the air, searching the area in an attempt to find its source. He could see gouges in the ground where claws had torn the grass up and left them in small heaps. He slowed his approach, not knowing what was out there. His eyes shifted to the ground, then shot up to the treetops, searching for whatever it was that had spooked her. Then he found it, a stain upon the tree several meters inside the tree line. He knelt down and inspected it. "What are you?" Yavik was cut off by a sharp look from Jaegryn. Continuing his search around the tree, Jaegryn's diligence was rewarded with a partial footprint next to a large tree. Judging by the curve of the foot, it was the left one. Standing, he positioned himself just behind the print. He gazed at the camp. If he leaned to the side, he could see the camp while most of his body remained hidden. The creature was here. The blood drained from Yavik's face, and a slight tremble took hold. His eyes became glassy as his mouth parted slightly. It didn't get her. At least not here, he thought to himself. We need to go west. Is there any place in that direction she would have gone? There are some caves up that way. Without another word, Jaegryn marched out from the tree line, past the camp and towards what he hoped was the still living Iza. The night sky was a vast and endless celestial sea, with stars twinkling like distant beacons guiding ships through the inky blackness. Beneath the watchful gaze of the satyr's eye, Jaegryn marched leading the way. His stride never faltering, he moved with determination and confidence, like a predator on the hunt. And that's what he was. A predator picking its way between the rocks that had become larger and more numerous the further they followed the cliff face. Behind him, the heavy, panted breaths of Yavik disturbed the peace of the forest, echoing out into the night as he tried to keep up. Yavik stumbled along, tripping and crying out. Each time, Jaegryn had to tamp down on the anger that welled up within him. Save it for your prey. Then, with one swift movement, Jaegryn's hand shot up, demanding a halt to their procession. He cocked his head. What? Yavik asked as he came up beside Jaegryn, his eyes darting back and forth as though he had some hope of breaching the impenetrable blackness of the tree line. Jaegryn breathed in. The air here was thick and heavy, as though pregnant with the promise of rain. Yet scanning the horizon, he couldn't see a cloud in sight. A rumble settled deep within his chest. I heard something. Yavik, having learned some modicum of self-control, remained silent. He didn't irritate Jaegryn with the typical useless questions. The two stood as though fixed within the silence, much like the trees that had been standing there for an eternity. The hairs on the back of Jaegryn's neck rose like hackles. The individual hairs set upon the fur collar of his armor whipped about as a cold gust of wind rushed past. This place was different. This place didn't belong. It wasn't like the boulder he'd seen earlier. That had belonged. He scanned the area. Here the trees were more jagged, their branches twisting together to form a spider's web that wove together into a black horizon. The shadows almost seemed to move and drink up the meager starlight offered by the heavens. We're close. To Iza? Jaegryn was quiet for a moment. There was a familiarity within the man's voice. He'd tasted of that desperate hope a long time ago. He'd gladly partaken of its bitterness in the hopes that the world would just come to a happy ending. He turned and placed a hand upon Yavik's shoulder. The man's eyes went wide in surprise. The gesture even surprised Jaegryn. We're going to save her. Yavik's eyes dropped. You didn't mean her. You meant we were close to the creature. Jaegryn's hand fell away. How do you know? Do you know about the foundations? No. Jaegryn opened his mouth and then closed it. It wasn't the time for an explanation. It's the damned place where these creatures come from. It causes disturbances within the natural world. I can sense that the tear in the veil is nearby. Yavik blinked, only able to understand part of what Jaegryn had said. It doesn't matter. What does matter is that... Jaegryn spun. He had heard it again. Distant, muffled. Yet he knew for sure he'd heard it. A scream. Without another word, he took off, sprinting towards whatever he thought had been the origin. He heard it again. He adjusted his course, seeing a cave entrance 100 yards or so away. His heart pounded in his chest, his mouth widening in a frantic grin. Not only could he hear the screams of the woman, but he could smell the stench of the creature. He could hear its frantic cries. It must have cornered her somewhere where it couldn't reach her. He reached the cavern's entrance and stopped. There at the back of the cave was a woman pressed against the wall on a rock shelf. Below her, the creature stalked back and forth. It was just as the tavern owner had described. Dark fur, lanky. The creature stopped, its face turning towards him. Two searing orange orbs burned through the darkness, their fiery glower intensifying as they focused. They were set up upon an elongated canine-like face. The skin was gaunt and stretched as though whatever dark god had created this abomination had run out of materials. Its jaw quivered. Thick ropes of saliva dangled between rows of fangs that clacked together as it saw him. So you have a withering gaze, Jaegryn thought as he felt the heat of the gaze as though it were a physical force. Years ago, that gaze would have left its mark upon him, burning itself into his soul. Yet now he met it with a grin as he bent his legs in preparation. His heart pounded out an eager, expectant rhythm. Jaegryn let out a low growl as his fingertips split, his finger bones elongating into claws. He sent a command to his suit, and a heartbeat later the gauntlet retracted, exposing his hands to the cold night air. The creature roared. He roared back. The two rushed forward, their bodies colliding and falling to the ground. The creature's claws raked against his armor. His own claws rent deep tears in the creature's chest. It cried out. Jaegryn used the momentum to throw it to the side. He rose up to his full height, a wicked grin splitting his face. He popped his neck as he stalked forward. The creature hissed, holding its claws up as though to make itself appear bigger. A blackened river slithered down its body, creating a dark pool at its feet. Don't tell me you're already tired. The creature lunged forward, but Jaegryn smashed his fist against its face. The creature collapsed to the ground in a heap. Jaegryn hauled back and kicked the creature, his boot landing in its ribs. Get up! The creature shrieked in pain. It stumbled backwards, trying to escape, but it was too late. Much in the way that it had trapped Iza upon the rock shelf, it had become trapped between the cave wall and Jaegryn. Jaegryn reveled in the desperation and terror he saw flickering in the creature's eyes. It was so pathetic he didn't have to summon his blade. All for the better, he thought as he brought his hands up. Everything became a blur for him. He heard the sounds of flesh tearing. His hands became wet and slick with warmth. The sharp cries became ragged and wheezing. Yet the only thing that had not become hazy, had not lost its sharp dagger-like edge, was the rage within him. He pinned the creature to the ground and sank his claws deep into its flesh, shredding it apart piece by piece until all that remained of the wretched beast was the lifeless husk. It was over. Pathetic, Jaegryn said through heavy panted breaths as he threw the creature's limp body to the ground. Something moved behind him. He spun, fangs bare, clawed hands outstretched and ready to strike. He froze as he saw Yavik and Iza staring at him. At some point, she dropped down and he'd finally caught up. There was terror in those eyes. Jaegryn turned away. He couldn't bring himself to meet his companion's gaze as he heard them talking to each other. He could feel the elation in their voices and knew that they were glad to be together again. He instead knelt down and pulled a rag from his pouch and used it to wipe away the blood that now stained his claws. He was heavy, as though his body were made of stone. The anger that had ignited in him so quickly and suddenly had faded, leaving him feeling more hollow than ever before. That hot inferno within him had cooled and hardened like magma hitting water. "Thank you for protecting me," Isa said with a warmth that pulled him from his thoughts. Jaegryn stood and gave her a nod. Together the three made their way back to town. Jaegryn stopped short, watching the two lovers walking hand in hand as they headed back into town. Above him the sky was severed, the darkness retreating with the coming sun that brought with it the colors of dawn. The darkness, the shield of Satyr's eye, fled as it was consumed. He closed his eyes and turned away from them. He leaned heavy against the tree. When he opened them, he stared out into the town. A few people were up and about, performing their morning chores. He remembered what that was like, back when we had a home. He pushed the thought aside, trying to rebury it within the cold anger that had sustained him, but it was gone, burned out and used up. All that was left was the aching loneliness that seemed to linger in the pit of his being. Those who saw the couple rejoiced, their voices merging into a chorus. He watched from afar as people embraced and clapped each other on the back. He turned away, gazing at the tavern. It was so close, only a dozen yards or so away, yet it might as well have been halfway across the galaxy as far as he was concerned. He thought back to the boulder and shook his head. There was no place in this world for Jaegryn, the hunter of monsters. What terrified him more was the thought that there might not be any place in this universe for someone like him.
Greetings, it is I, your archivist. I hope that you enjoyed the story that you just got done listening to. As is always the case on YouTube, a like, share, and subscribe greatly benefits our channel. I'd like to also take this moment to invite you to check out my book, Jaegryn The First Law, on Amazon. It follows our moody, broody monster hunter as he searches for his mentor and the answers of his past, but ultimately gets caught up in a hunt that he is not prepared for. You can find the book on Amazon, and the link is in the description below. Also, if you like lore and behind the scenes content, then check out our Patreon, where not only will you get exclusive lore, but you'll also get access to stories. Link, of course, is in the description below.
Hi! Thanks for watching my dad's video. Did you find the secret lore? If you did, be sure to comment down below so we can know. Bye!